I was not supposed to be in that chamber. My name is Mara Voss, and I was 19 years old, standing in the back row of the Grand Council spire on Vareth 9, wearing a uniform 2 sizes too large because it belonged to Professor Aldrich Webb, who had broken his leg in 3 places the night before and could not walk, let alone travel. Someone had to take his seat as humanities observer. The council secretary had looked down her list, looked up at me, looked back down at the list, and said, with great reluctance, that I would have to do. I had said thank you, and tried to sound like I belonged there. I did not belong there. The Grand Council spire was not a building. It was an argument made out of architecture. It rose from the surface of Vareth 9, like something the planet had been trying to say for 1,000,000 years, and had finally found the words. The central chamber alone could have swallowed 3 Earth cities whole. The ceiling was so far above my head that it had its own weather system. I could see thin clouds moving near the upper observation rings. I had looked at that ceiling for 10 seconds before I decided it was safer to look at the floor. There were 47 species represented in that chamber. I had studied about 30 of them in class. The other 17 were things I had no words for yet. The Driath delegates were 60 meters tall and had to sit in a separate gallery carved into the far wall, because they could not physically fit on the main floor. The Solhari were so small they sat on elevated platforms, each one barely the size of my hand. And yet when their lead speaker addressed the room, her voice filled every corner of it like thunder rolling through a valley. Humanity had observer status. That meant I could sit, I could listen. I could not speak, vote, object, or contribute in any formal way. I was there as a courtesy, the way you might let a child sit at the edge of a dinner table, while the adults talked about things the child was too young to understand. I sat in the back, I kept my hands in my lap, I watched. For the first 2 hours of the session, the council moved through routine matters. Trade route renegotiations between the Vorkai and the Sithari Compact, a territorial boundary dispute over a gas giant no one actually wanted, but everyone wanted the other side not to have. A proposal for new quarantine standards following a biological incident on the Keth colony worlds that I had read about briefly, but did not fully understand. None of it involved Earth. None of it involved me. I took notes on my small data tablet and tried to look like I understood everything. Then the chamber changed. It did not change because of any noise or announcement. It changed the way a room changes when the temperature drops suddenly. One moment the delegates were shifting in their seats and checking data screens. The next, every head in the chamber had turned toward the central floor, where a figure had stepped up to the speaker's platform. He was tall even by Vorkai standards. The Vorkai were a species that had been building starships before Earth had discovered fire, and they looked like it. There was something ancient and precise about them, the way old stone buildings feel both permanent and patient. This one was called Keth Saran. I knew the name. Everyone in any field touching xenobiology knew the name. He had written 14 books, each one considered the definitive work in its subject area. He discovered 3 new species, negotiated first contact with 2 others, and had once reportedly kept a Vrethkai attack drone in a containment field in his laboratory, just to study the way it moved. That last part was relevant to what happened next. He did not greet the council. He did not open with pleasantries. He placed both hands on the edge of the speaker's platform and said, in a voice that carried without effort, "I need a volunteer." The chamber was already quiet. Now it became the kind of quiet that has weight to it. The Vrethkai has been active on the disputed moon of Kareth 7 for 11 standard weeks, he said. In that time it has destroyed 2 Vorkai heavy assault divisions, 1 Sethari naval strike force, a Driath Ketha rapid response team, and every automated weapons system we have been able to deploy. The creature has adapted to each new attack faster than the last. Standard kinetic weapons are now useless. Directed energy weapons are now useless. Targeted biological agents were dismissed by its immune response in under 6 hours. He paused. The chamber waited. It is not destroying out of hunger or territorial instinct. It is not following a program. It is learning. Every engagement teaches it something. Every new weapon we introduce becomes a weapon it can dismantle. We have run projections. Within 9 months, if we continue our current approach, it will have adapted to every known combat method in the Galactic catalog. At that point, no conventional force will be able to stop it. One of the Sethari delegates raised a narrow hand. Then we deploy orbital bombardment. Remove the moon entirely. The moon contains the only known deposit of Areth 9 mineral compound in this sector. Keth Saran replied without looking at her. 17 species depend on that compound for atmospheric processing technology. Removing the moon would trigger ecological failure across 4 inhabited systems within a decade. That option is not available. The Sethari delegate lowered her hand. What I need, Kethsran said, is a different kind of engagement. Not to kill the creature. to study its adaptation response in real time, under controlled conditions, to find the pattern underneath the learning, to understand how it adapts, not just that it adapts. If we understand the mechanism, we can find the gap in it. He let the silence sit for a moment. To do that, I need a subject who will enter the engagement arena on Karath 7 and fight the Vrethkai, not to win, not to survive through superior firepower, simply to engage, repeatedly, across multiple sessions, while my instruments record every variable. The subject will be provided with the best available shielding technology. The risk of fatal injury is approximately, he consulted a data screen briefly, 31% per session. A sound moved through the chamber, not quite a murmur, more like the collective reaction of 47 species, all processing the same number at the same moment. Who will fight my beast? No one moved. I watched the delegates. The Driath, who were the closest thing the galaxy had to professional soldiers, did not move. Their lead commander, a figure so large that his stillness looked like a small mountain deciding to remain a mountain, did not even shift his weight. The Keth, who were known for taking risks that other species considered recreational, exchanged glances and stayed seated. The Sethari looked at the floor. The Solhari looked at their hands. Everyone looked at everything except the speaker's platform. 43 seconds passed. I counted them. On the 44th second, my hand went up. I want to be clear, I did not plan to do that. My hand simply went up, the way your hand sometimes moves before your brain has finished its sentence. I had been sitting in the back row, taking notes, being invisible, and then my arm was in the air, and Keth Saran was looking at me from across the enormous chamber, with an expression I could not read, and every delegate in the room had turned to look at the back row where the human was sitting. There was a moment of complete silence. Then, from the Driath gallery, came a sound that I later learned was the Driath equivalent of laughter. Kesran looked at me for a long moment. Then he said very carefully, "You are human." "Yes," I said. "You have observer status." "Yes." "You understand what I described." 31% chance per session, I said. "Yes." Another, he tilted his head slightly, the Vorkai gesture for intense focus. "May I ask your reasoning?" I thought about that for a second. The honest answer was that I had no idea why my hand had gone up, but I did have a reason I could give, and it happened to be true. "I grew up on Mars Colony 4, I said. "Before the resettlement, when the dome systems were still failing every other month. You get used to things trying to kill you. You learn to move fast and think weird and not panic. I figure weird and fast might be useful." The Driath sound came again, louder this time. Keth Saran looked at me for 3 more seconds. Then he said, "What is your name?" "Maravas." "Maravas," he repeated, as though testing the weight of it. "Are you genuinely offering, or were you startled into raising your hand?" I thought about lying. I thought about saying something brave and calculated. Instead, I said, "Both, probably. But I'm not putting it down." He looked at me for another long moment. Then he said, to the full council, in a voice that carried without effort, "The human volunteer will be accepted. We proceed to Karath 7 in 48 hours. The Driath laughter had stopped. The chamber was completely quiet again. I lowered my hand slowly and looked down at my data tablet. My notes from the last 2 hours looked very calm and organized. I had excellent handwriting for someone whose heart was currently trying to leave her body through her chest. I sat there in the back row, in a uniform 2 sizes too large, in a chamber that held 47 civilizations and could have swallowed 3 cities whole. And I thought about what I had just done. Outside the great windows of the spire, the stars were very still and very far away, and they did not look like they were impressed, or worried, or paying any attention at all. I decided that was fine. I had never needed anyone to be impressed. I had just needed the chance. Whether I had just made the best or worst decision of my short life was a question the next 48 hours would begin to answer. I closed my data tablet, stood up very quietly, and walked out of the chamber before anyone could ask me to reconsider. Karath 7's moon had no name in any language I spoke. In the Vorkai catalog, it was listed as a set of coordinates and a mineral classification number. In my head, for the 2 days it took us to get there, I called it the waiting place. It seemed like the kind of location that had always been waiting for something to happen on it, patient the way Dead Rock is patient, which is to say without any awareness that it is being patient at all. The transit ship was Vorkai design, which meant it was extremely fast, extremely clean, and designed with complete indifference to human proportions. The ceiling in my quarters was high enough to land a small aircraft in. The bed was long enough for a creature with 3 times my body length. I slept diagonally and spent the rest of the time in the ship's small research section, where Keth Saran had set up a working laboratory that occupied every available surface and several that were not technically surfaces. He did not speak to me for the first day. He moved through his data and his equipment with a focus so complete that I felt slightly invisible, which under the circumstances was a relief. I read everything I could find about the Vrethkai. There was not a great deal of material, because until recently the standard approach to the Vrethkai had been to shoot it until it stopped moving, which had never worked, but had also never produced much useful scientific documentation. What I found was enough to keep me awake. The Vrethkai was classified as a megafauna predator, though that classification felt insufficient in the same way calling a thunderstorm weather felt insufficient. It was 41 meters long when moving on all 6 limbs, taller when it reared up, which the footage I found suggested it did often and with apparent ease. Its exterior was silicon ceramic, a natural armor that had formed over hundreds of millions of years of evolution in an environment where everything that had ever tried to eat it had eventually given up. Its sensory organs were distributed across its body rather than concentrated in a head, which meant there was no single point of disorientation you could aim for. It had no eyes in any conventional sense. It perceived the world through vibration, thermal signature, electromagnetic pulse, and some additional sense that the Vorkai research team had labeled, without obvious enthusiasm, Unknown Mechanism 7. The adaptation capability was the part I kept returning to. It was not armor repair, though it did that too. It was something more fundamental. The Vrethkai's exterior could restructure itself at a molecular level in response to a detected threat. A kinetic impact would cause the local area of its hide to redistribute mass, harden specific compounds, and alter surface geometry within seconds of the first hit. By the third hit from the same weapon system, the impact was being absorbed as cleanly as if the weapon had struck open water. Directed energy caused a similar response in a different chemical pathway. The creature had been doing this, the data suggested, for roughly 400 million years. It had, in evolutionary terms, already won every fight it was ever going to have. The universe had simply not gotten around to telling it yet. On the second day, Kethsaran sat down across from me in the research section and looked at the data screen I was reading. "That is the full adaptation catalog," he said. "I found it in the ship's research archive," I said. "I know. I put it there." He paused. "I wanted to see if you would read it. I would have read it either way." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Most warriors who have agreed to engagement briefings have chosen not to read the full catalog. They found it, I believe, discouraging. "It is discouraging," I said, "but I'd rather be discouraged and informed than comfortable and wrong." He tilted his head slightly, the same gesture of intense focus I had seen in the council chamber. "You said you grew up on Mars Colony 4. Until I was 12, yes. The atmospheric failures, the dome pressure issues, and the water rationing, and the power cycling, and the time the Eastern Agricultural Section had to be evacuated for 6 months because of a mineral gas leak." I looked back at the screen. A lot of things tried to kill us out there. None of them were 41 meters tall, but some of them were very creative. "What did you learn from that?" I thought about it. "That there's almost always something you haven't tried yet," I said. "When the obvious things don't work, you find the not obvious things. You look weird. You do unexpected things. You make the problem not know what you're going to do next, because if it knows what you're going to do, it's already preparing an answer." Kethsaran was very still. "That is," he said slowly, "a surprisingly precise description of the theoretical gap in the Vrethkai's adaptation system." I looked at him. "The adaptation mechanism requires a detectable pattern," he said. "It reads an incoming attack, classifies it, and builds a counter-response. The gap, theoretically, is unpredictability. If an engagement pattern cannot be classified, the adaptation response is delayed. The creature is not invulnerable to the unknown. It is only invulnerable to the known." He paused. "The problem is that every intelligent species in the galaxy fights according to deeply ingrained patterns. Even when attempting to be unpredictable, trained warriors follow recognized combat logic. The Vrethkai has encountered all of it. But not humans," I said. "Humanity has been in contact with the Galactic community for 11 years, he said. "You have never been in a large-scale engagement with any species. You have no documented combat history that the Vrethkai system could have cataloged." He paused again. "This is why I accepted your offer. I had wondered about that. Not because you thought I was brave. Bravery is common," he said. "Novel data is rare. I appreciated the honesty. So I'm not your warrior. I'm your experiment. You are my best available variable," he said. "The distinction matters to me if it matters to you." It did slightly, but I had already made the decision, and I was not the kind of person who unmakes decisions after 2 days of travel. "Tell me what you need me to do," I said. What followed was 12 hours of briefing, physical fitting, equipment calibration, and something Kethsaran called an engagement philosophy discussion. That was mostly him talking, and me asking questions that made him pause, and then answer in ways that seemed to surprise even him. The shielding technology was Vorkai military grade, which meant it was substantially better than anything humanity had access to, and still not something I should rely on absolutely. It would absorb significant kinetic force and deflect thermal events. It would not make me invulnerable, but it would give me time to react. The objective was not to defeat the Vrethkai. The objective was to engage it, take hits, recover, re-engage, and keep doing this for as long as possible while Keth Saran's instruments recorded everything. Each session would be timed. When the timer ended, an automated extraction system would pull me out regardless of the engagement state. On the third morning, we reached Karath 7's moon. The engagement arena was a section of the moon's surface enclosed within a transparent barrier field, 3 kilometers in diameter. The surface inside was rough and varied, full of rock formations and open ground and deep shadow pockets between stone outcroppings. The Vrethkai was already there. I could see it from the observation platform before I went down. A dark shape moving with slow deliberation through the far end of the arena. And even at that distance, at that scale, the sight of it did something to my stomach that no amount of mental preparation could have prevented. Keth Saran was at his instruments. His research team, 6 Vorkai scientists, were at their stations. The extraction system was confirmed active. The timer was set for 20 minutes for the first session. Ready? Keth Saran asked, not looking up from his screens. No, I said. Going anyway. The transport platform dropped me into the arena. The Vrethkai found me in 11 seconds. I know because I counted. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not a fight in any sense I had ever understood the word. A fight implies 2 sides with a chance of winning. This was something else. This was me and a creature that had survived 400 million years of everything the universe had thrown at it. And I was the newest thing in a very old game. It moved faster than anything that size had any right to move. The first strike caught me while I was still adjusting to the scale of it. Still making the mental shift between knowing it was 41 meters long and standing in the actual physical space with something that was 41 meters long. The impact lifted me off my feet and threw me into a rock formation 20 meters away. The shielding absorbed most of it. My back absorbed the rest. I lay against the rock for approximately 2 seconds, checked that all my limbs were responding, and stood up. The Vrethkai stopped. It was not a hesitation. It was something more deliberate, like a calculation being interrupted mid-process. It had registered the impact, registered the removal of the target from primary contact position, and then registered the target returning to standing position. And somewhere in that sequence, something had not matched its expected output. I used those seconds. I moved sideways, not backward, which was not the direction the creature's movement pattern suggested it was expecting. I put a large rock formation between myself and its primary sensory cluster. I could not hide from it. Nothing could hide from it in any effective sense, but I could make its targeting geometry work harder than it was used to working. It came around the rock formation in a way that suggested it had already calculated every possible path I could take from that position, and selected the most efficient counter, which it had, except that when it arrived at the expected intercept point, I was not there because I had gone over the rock formation rather than around it, which was not a logical path for any organized combat methodology, but was a very logical path for someone who had spent her childhood climbing things that were not meant to be climbed because the shortest route between 2 points in a failing colony dome was whichever one the environmental hazard had not yet reached. The second impact was harder. The third was harder still. By the fourth, I had found a rhythm that was not really a rhythm so much as a series of decisions made in the half-second between one thing happening and the next. Each decision based more on instinct than calculation. Each decision wrong in a technically analyzable way, but somehow producing outcomes the creature's system was not readily classifying. When the extraction system activated at the end of 20 minutes, I was at the far end of the arena, behind 3 separate rock formations, breathing very hard and bleeding slightly from a cut on my chin where my helmet seal had shifted during the 4th impact. The Vrethkai was standing approximately 40 meters away, facing my position, completely still. It had been still for the last 4 minutes of the session. On the observation platform, Keth Saran's research team was not quiet. I could hear their voices before the transport platform reached the top, rapid exchanges in Vorkai that I could not follow. When I stepped off the platform, Keth Saran turned from his instruments and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on a Vorkai face before. "Your adaptation suppression rate," he said, in the final 6 minutes of that session was 43% above the baseline recorded from any previous engagement. I pulled the helmet off and sat down heavily on the nearest surface. What does that mean? It means the creature's adaptation mechanism was operating at less than 60% of its recorded capacity, he said. It means it could not fully classify what you were doing. He paused. It means the theory is not only correct, it is working. I looked at my hands, they were shaking slightly, which was a reasonable response to recent events. Good, I said. You are also injured. So good, I said. Means I was close enough to matter. He was silent for a moment. Then he said very carefully, the next session is in 18 hours. I suggest you sleep. I suggest that too, I said. I did not sleep for 7 of those hours. I spent them going over every second of the engagement in my head, not because I was frightened, though I was, but because I was looking for the not obvious things, the unexpected paths, the decisions that the creature could not classify because no documented species had ever made them. I was looking for the gaps. There were more of them than I had initially seen. By the time I did sleep, I had a rough map of the arena in my head and 11 approaches I had not tried yet. Tomorrow I would try them. Kethsaran's lab on the moon base was not large. It had been assembled quickly from Vorkai field research equipment, which meant everything was functional, precise, and built for a species whose average height was 2.5 meters. I had spent a week in it by the time he called me in at what the station clock marked as early morning. He had not slept. I could tell. Not because Vorkai showed fatigue the same way humans did, but because there was a particular quality of intense stillness that came over him when he had been working through the night. A kind of focused quiet that made him look like a piece of very old, very purposeful machinery running at full output. He had 3 screens open and was moving between them with a speed that suggested he had been moving between them for many hours. Sit, he said, without turning around. I sat. He turned around. He looked at me for a long moment with the head tilt of intense focus that I had by now catalogued as one of his primary expressions. The data from sessions 2 through 7, he said, has produced something I was not expecting. Good something or bad something, plex something, he said. He turned back to the screens and brought up a visual display. It was a wave pattern, or rather a set of wave patterns laid on top of each other, each one a different color. This is the Vrethkai's adaptation rate across all 7 sessions. The blue line is session 1. The green line is the baseline average from all previous recorded engagements with other species. The green line was high and steep and consistent. It climbed sharply within the first 2 minutes of engagement and then leveled out near the top, which meant the creature had been at near full adaptation capacity within minutes of every previous fight. The blue line was different. It started high, dropped in the middle, and had a long flat section at the end. That is what we expected to see, Kethsaran said. Unpredictability suppressing the adaptation response. But look at sessions 4 through 7. He brought up 4 more lines. They were not flat at the end. They were not even consistent in their drops. They were jagged, irregular, rising and falling in patterns that looked almost like responses rather than suppressions. What am I looking at? I asked. You are looking at the Vrethkai not simply failing to adapt, he said. You are looking at the Vrethkai trying to communicate. The room felt very still for a moment. Explain, I said. He moved to the second screen. The Vrethkai's adaptation system is not only a defensive mechanism. Our initial research framed it that way, but the underlying biology is more complex. The same molecular restructuring that allows it to counter physical threats is also, in its base evolutionary form, a signaling system, a language. When Vrethkai of the same species encountered each other, millions of years ago, they communicated through physical pattern, through movement, through surface texture changes, through the specific geometry of engagement. He paused. The adaptation responses we have been recording in your sessions are not purely defensive outputs. Some of them are signals. The creature is responding to you the way it would respond to another Vrethkai. I stared at the wave patterns for a long moment. It thinks I'm talking to it. It is not clear that thinks applies in the way you mean it, he said, but the structural response suggests that your movement patterns, specifically the non-linear, improvised quality of them, are producing outputs that the Vrethkai's system recognizes as linguistically structured. Not words, not concepts necessarily, but patterns with internal logic, patterns that feel to whatever sensory apparatus Vrethkai uses, like an attempt at contact. I sat back slowly. All those times I was trying to be unpredictable, I said. I was accidentally being coherent. In a language neither of us knew existed, he said. Yes, there was a long silence. On the screens, the wave patterns made their jagged, complicated shapes, rising and falling like a voice in a language I was only beginning to understand that I had been speaking. Does that change what we're doing? I asked. It changes everything about what we're doing, he said. He turned back to me. I have been building translation models for 4 days. I am not yet at the point of two-way communication, but I believe with enough session data I can construct a basic framework, a starting point. He paused. The problem is time. How much do we have? He was quiet for a moment too long. Kethsaran. There is a political situation I should explain, he said. What he explained took 20 minutes and left me with a cold, settled feeling in my stomach that was different from fear and worse in some ways. The Vorkai military faction on the council, a group led by a commander named Vorith the Deal, who had lost 2 assault divisions to the Vrethkai and had very clear ideas about what should be done as a result, had been watching our sessions with growing discomfort, not because the research was failing, because it was succeeding in a direction they had not anticipated. They had expected the study to produce a weaknesses catalog, a list of gaps in the Vrethkai's defenses that could be exploited with a new weapons system. Instead, it was producing communication data, evidence of intelligence, and in the political calculus of the Galactic Council, a creature that could be demonstrated to possess intelligence was a creature that could not legally be destroyed without a full council review, which would take months, during which time the moon and its mineral deposits would remain inaccessible, and the Vrethkai would still be active and uncontrolled. Vorith Deal had filed a motion to terminate the research program and proceed directly to orbital bombardment of the moon. The vote was scheduled in 6 days. 6 days, I said. 6 days, Kethsaran confirmed. After which, regardless of our findings, the Council will most likely authorize the bombardment. The Ethran delegate has indicated she will delay the final vote by 24 hours if we can provide preliminary evidence of a communication attempt. But only 24 hours. I looked at the wave patterns on his screens. How far are you from a workable translation framework? At current data collection rates, approximately 9 to 11 days. So we need to go faster. We need more session data. More sessions per day. Longer sessions, he paused. The physical risk increases proportionally. I know. The shielding has limits. 3 sessions in a single day would approach those limits. I know that too. He looked at me. You are not afraid. I'm afraid, I said. I'm just used to being afraid while doing things anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Mars Colony 4. Mars Colony 4, I agreed. What followed was 3 days that I remember in a particular compressed way. The way you remember very intense periods of time. Not as a sequence of separate events, but as a single sustained experience with different textures and temperatures running through it. I went into the arena 3 times a day, morning, midday, and late evening by the station clock. Each session was longer than the previous cycle. The Vrethkai's behavior was changing in ways that Kethsaran's instruments tracked obsessively, and that I felt in a more immediate, less scientific sense. It was still fast, it was still powerful. It could still send me across the arena, with a single strike hard enough to make the shielding flash warning colors. But there were moments, growing longer each session, where it would stop and orient toward me in a way that was not threatening, where its surface would do something complex and rippling that Kethsaran's translation model was beginning, slowly, imperfectly, to read. On the 3rd evening of that compressed period, Kethsaran called me over to his instruments between the 2nd and 3rd session of the day. I have a partial translation, he said. I want you to hear it. He played a recording from that afternoon's 2nd session. On the visual display, the Vrethkai's surface rippled in a complex pattern during a 7-second pause in the engagement. Kethsaran's model ran over it and produced a line of text in standard Galactic script that the translation software then rendered into English for my benefit. The translation was imperfect. He had warned me about that. The model was working with limited data and a language structure unlike anything in the existing Galactic catalog. But the approximate meaning of those 7 seconds was rendered as 4 words. It said, "You come back again," not a question, not a threat, an observation that had in it, even through the imperfect filter of an incomplete translation model, something that I could only describe as recognition. I stood very still for a long moment. Then I said, "Can I send something back?" Kethsaran looked at me. "The output side of the translation model is not complete. Can I try something simpler?" I said, "Not words, just pattern." In the engagement, I looked at the display. It's been responding to my movement patterns as language. If I make my movements more deliberate in the next session, more structured, can your instruments tell if it reads them differently? He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "The instruments can read that." "Then I'll try something." "What will you try?" I thought about the dome on Mars Colony 4, about the patterns we used when the communication systems were down, hand signals and body language developed over years of shared emergency. Simple things, things a child could learn, things that meant in their most basic form, one of only a few necessary messages. "I'm going to try to tell it I hear it," I said. The 3rd session of that evening was different. I went into the arena and the Vrethkai came to find me with its usual efficient speed, and we did the thing we had been doing for days, the engagement that was not quite a fight and was not quite a conversation, but was becoming something in the space between those 2 words. And at one point, when the creature paused and its surface began to ripple in the pattern that the translation model associated with communication, I stopped moving entirely. I did not try to run, I did not try to maneuver. I stood still in the middle of the arena and I made a deliberate, structured movement with my whole body. A pattern. Simple and repeated. Something that in its structure said, I am here, I am listening, I am not leaving. The Vrethkai was still for 11 seconds. Then its surface rippled in a pattern that Keth Saran's instruments, working overtime on the live feed, translated with low confidence but persistent output as something close to. Strange small thing. You are very loud. I was breathless and bruised and covered in the dust of the arena, and I laughed until the extraction timer sounded. Back on the observation platform, Keth Saran's research team was working faster than I had seen them work all week. 3 of them were speaking rapidly over the instrument feeds. The other 3 were running translation model updates in parallel. Keth Saran himself was standing at the central display with both hands on the edge of it, leaning forward, watching the data arrive. How much time do we have? I asked. Before the vote. 3 days, he said without turning around. Is it enough? He did not answer immediately. He watched the data for another moment, and then he straightened and looked at me. And there was something in his expression that I had not seen there before. Something that, on a human face, I would have called hope. It may be, he said. If nothing interrupts us, something interrupted us. I was in the small side room off the main lab, going over session footage on a data tablet, and eating something Keth Saran's team had provided that was technically food in the nutritional sense, even if it had no strong opinions about flavor, when I heard voices in the main lab, more voices than should have been there. A particular quality of formal language that meant official visitors. I went to the doorway and looked through. There were 4 figures in Vorkai military uniform standing in the center of the lab. They were speaking to Keth Saran, who was standing very straight and very still, with the quality of stillness that I now recognized as a Vorkai expression of controlled, strong feeling. One of the military figures was doing most of the talking. He was not Vorathdil himself, but he was clearly someone who reported to Vorathdil, and he was delivering a message that, even in Vorkai, had the clear structure of an order being given to someone who was expected to comply. I did not speak much Vorkai. I had learned a few words and phrases over the weeks I had spent on the moon, but I knew the words for research permit and suspended and immediately, and I heard all 3 of them in the same sentence. Keth Saran said something in response. The official figure said something back that was shorter and harder. Keth Saran's research team, standing around the edges of the lab, did not move or speak. The official figure and his 3 companions left. Keth Saran stood where he was for a moment after they were gone. Then he turned and saw me in the doorway. The research permit has been suspended pending the council vote, he said. Effective immediately. No further sessions are authorized. I looked at him. Vorathdil moved the vote forward, he said. It is now in 36 hours, not 3 days. The cold settled feeling was back in my stomach. What do we do? I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. I do not know, he said. And it was the first time in all the weeks I had known him that he had said those words. And the weight of them was different from what I had expected. Not defeat. Something more like a scientist confronting a genuinely unsolved problem. I sat down on a work stool and looked at the data screens. The wave patterns were still there, the jagged, complicated shapes of a language we had only just begun to read. The translation model was running even now, updating itself on the session data we already had, getting more precise with every passing hour. 36 hours. I thought about what I knew. I thought about Troudy's picture in the arena, standing still at the end of the last session, with its surface-making patterns that our model was only now beginning to translate. I thought about 4 words. You come back again. I thought about what it was like to be something that the whole galaxy had decided was a problem to be solved by removing it. Something that had been alone for so long that when it finally sensed something that might be listening, it didn't even know how to say what it needed to say, so it said the only thing it could. You come back again. I picked up my data tablet and started going over the translation model. 36 hours was not enough to finish the framework. That was true, but it might be enough to do something else. Something that did not require a finished framework. Something that did not require political approval or research permits or formal council processes. Something that only required me to walk into the arena one more time, without a timer and without weapons, and trust that the strange small thing that was very loud had made enough of an impression to matter. I worked through the night. The morning of the vote, the observation platform above the arena had more occupants than it had ever held. Keth Saran's research team had been joined by a group of council delegates, who had traveled to the moon after the vote date was moved, including the Ethran delegate, Venshala, who was the oldest living member of the council and moved slowly and spoke rarely, and according to Keth Saran, had not personally attended any council proceeding outside of Vareth 9 in 60 years. She had come here specifically for this, which told me something about how seriously she was taking it. Vorath Deal was also present. He stood on the far side of the observation platform with his staff, 4 Vorkai military officials in formal uniform, and he looked at the arena below with the expression of someone who had already decided the outcome and was here only to confirm it. I was not on the observation platform. I was at the bottom of the transport shaft, in the shielding equipment, checking the clasps for the 3rd time because it was something to do with my hands. Keth Saran came down to me 10 minutes before the session was scheduled to begin. The session that was not officially authorized. The session that Venshala had privately approved as a condition of delaying the vote by 24 hours, and that Vorath Deal had not been able to prevent, because Venshala outranked him in the council structure by more years than most species had been spacefaring. How is the translation model? I asked. At 67% reliability for basic structural patterns, he said. It will be running live during the session. Everything the Vrethkai produces will be processed in real time. Everything you do will be analyzed against the output model I built yesterday. The output model, I said. You finished it. I finished a version of it, he said carefully. It is not complete. It cannot produce complex communication. But it can take simple, structured physical input and render it into a pattern that the Vrethkai's system should recognize as linguistically coherent. He paused. If you make deliberate, structured movements of a specific kind, I can translate them. Not words, not exactly, but signal. That's enough, I said. He looked at me for a moment. You are not wearing weapons. No. The shielding will protect you from significant impact. But without engagement tools, if the creature decides this is not a communication session but a threat presentation, your extraction window is 14 seconds. That is not a comfortable margin. No, I agreed, it isn't. He was quiet. Then he said, when I asked the council who would fight my beast, I did not anticipate this. What did you anticipate? Something more straightforward, he said. A warrior, data, a path to a tactical solution. He paused. Not this. Is this bad? He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said. I think this is better. He straightened. The instruments are ready. My team is ready. Venshala is watching. Whatever happens in the next hour will be recorded with complete precision and presented to the council before the vote closes. He looked at me directly. Whatever happens. Whatever happens, I agreed. The transport platform took me down. The arena looked the same as it always did. The same rough rock formations. The same wide stretches of open ground. The same shadow pockets between stone outcroppings where I had learned to move quickly and had learned, more slowly, to move with purpose. The barrier field hummed at the edges, barely visible, a slight shimmer in the light. The Vrethkai was at the far end, and it turned toward me before the platform had finished descending. It always found me fast. That had not changed. What had changed, over many sessions, was what happened after it found me. In the early days, it had come at me immediately, the way it had come at everything. With the complete and total conviction of something that had never encountered serious resistance, and had organized its entire approach to the world around that fact. Now it paused, it oriented, it waited briefly, in a way that its entire evolutionary history suggested it should not be doing. I stepped off the platform and walked toward it. Not running, not maneuvering, walking, directly across the open ground, with no rock formation between me and it, no clever angle of approach, nothing tactical at all. Just walking toward it, the way you walk towards something you need to talk to. I heard, very faintly through the communication link in my helmet, Keth Saran's voice saying one word to his team. Just recording. The Vrethkai watched me come. When I was 30 meters away, it made a sound I had not heard before. A low-frequency vibration that I felt more than heard, that moved through the ground and through my shielding and through the soles of my feet and up through my whole body like a question. I stopped. I made a movement, not a combat movement, not an evasion. I had worked on this through the night, going over the basic signal patterns from Mars Colony 4, the things that meant simple necessary things when words were not possible. I took the shape of those signals and I structured them deliberately, the way Keth Saran's output model needed them structured, into something that might translate. Something that said, in the only language available, I am here, I am not threatening you, I want to understand. The Vrethkai's surface rippled. In my helmet very quietly, Keth Saran said, it's reading you. The Vrethkai took 3 steps toward me. 3 slow, heavy steps that sent vibrations through the ground I could feel clearly. It stopped 15 meters away. Its surface was doing the complex, layered movement that the translation model had been learning to read. Keth Saran's voice came through the link again, and this time there was something in it that I had not heard from him before. A crack in the professional precision. Something younger and more unguarded. "It's saying," he said, and his voice was careful and slow. "Something approximate to, you kept coming back. Every time I struck you down, you came back." I took a breath. I looked at the creature in front of me. 41 meters of 400 million years of surviving everything the universe had tried, standing 15 meters away, waiting. I made another structured movement. Keth Saran processed it, and I heard the output model translate it as it sent back yes. I kept coming back. "I am still here." The Vreth Kai was still for 20 seconds. Its surface made a slow, complex pattern that the translation model worked on for several seconds before Keth Saran read it out. Approximate translation: "I have been alone. For a long time. Nothing ever." His voice stopped for a moment. "Keth Saran." "Nothing ever," he said, came back. The observation platform above us was completely silent. I could not see it from where I stood, but I knew that Venshala was up there, and Vorath that deal and Keth Saran's team, and the recording instruments that were capturing every millisecond of this. I knew that what was happening right now was being transmitted to the council chamber on Vareth 9 in real time. I stood in the middle of the arena with no weapons and no tactical plan and no margin for error, and I made another movement. This one took longer. Keth Saran was quiet while the output model processed it. Then he said quietly, "It's translating roughly as 'I came back because you were here. I came back because you were trying to say something. I came back because something that tries that hard to be heard deserves someone to listen." 12 seconds of stillness. 15. The Vrethkai lowered its mass. Not completely. Not in the way of something surrendering or yielding. In the way of something that had been carrying attention for a very long time, and was, for the first time, finding that it did not need to hold it quite so tightly. Its surface moved in a long, slow pattern. The translation model ran for almost 30 seconds before Keth Saran spoke. When he did, his voice was different from any version of his voice I had heard before. Not the professor. Not the scientist. Just someone who had spent his whole life trying to understand something, and had just gotten closer to it than he had ever expected to get. "It says," he read, "I was alone, now something heard. On the observation platform, no one spoke for a long time." Then Venshala's voice came through the general channel, directed to the council chamber on Vareth 9. Clear and slow, and carrying the particular authority of 60 years of being the person in the room that everyone else listened to. She said, "I am delaying the vote indefinitely. I am filing a motion to classify the entity on Kareth 7 as a sentient being under Article 12 of the Galactic Compact. I am further filing a motion to establish this moon as a protected communication zone under Joint Vorkai Council research oversight." She paused. "Humanity's observer status is hereby referred to the full council for review. The grounds for the referral are original diplomatic contact with a previously unclassified sentient species, conducted without weapons, by a 19-year-old from a failing colony on a red planet that most of us have never visited." Another pause. "I suggest we consider what that means about humanity. I suggest we take our time with that consideration." In the arena, the Vrethkai and I stood 15 meters apart in the quiet. Its surface was still doing something slow and complex that the translation model was working on. I waited for Keth Saran to read it. He did eventually, in a voice that had steadied itself back into its professional register, but had something warmer underneath it now. Something that would not quite go away. "It says, strange small thing, you are very loud, but I think," he paused, "I think I will learn to understand you." I stood there for a moment. Then I made one more movement. Simple. Something that needed no translation model, no galactic catalog, no years of research and data collection. Something that was the same in every language I knew. I put my hand up open, toward it. The Vrethkai looked at it for a long time. Then it moved one forward limb and touched the air 3 inches from my hand, and held it there. In the observation room above I heard very softly the sound of Keth Saran exhaling. The aftermath came quickly once things began moving, the way things do when the right evidence reaches the right people at the right moment. The vote that was supposed to authorize the bombardment of the moon became, over the next 72 hours, a vote about something else entirely. It became a vote about what kind of civilization the galactic community wanted to say it was, whether the speed of a military solution was worth more than the slowness of understanding. Venshala argued for 3 hours. I was not in the chamber this time, but Keth Saran transmitted the audio, and I listened from the moon base. She was old, and she spoke slowly, and every sentence had the weight of someone who had seen 60 years of decisions made quickly, and decades spent recovering from them. She used our session recordings. She used the translation model output. She used the simple fact that something had stood in that arena for 3 weeks, been struck down over and over, and kept coming back, not to win but to listen. Vorathdil argued against, he argued well. He was not wrong about the risks, the unknowns, the practical difficulties of the path forward. But he was arguing against something that the chamber had already, in some collective and quiet way, already decided. The vote was 41-6. The Vrethkai was classified as a sentient entity. The moon was declared a protected research zone. A joint communication research project was established under Keth Saran's direction, with a 7-year mandate and an unprecedented level of council funding, and humanity, which had gone to Vareth 9 without a vote or a voice or a seat at the front, was formally referred for full council membership review on the grounds of first diplomatic contact. Keth Saran came to find me after the result came through. I was sitting in the research section of the moon base, looking at the wave patterns on the data screens for what I already knew would be one of the last times before the project infrastructure was transferred to the new joint team. He sat down across from me. He was quiet for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," he said. I looked at him. "For what?" "I told you that you were my best available variable," he said. "That bravery was common and novel data was rare." He paused with accurate, but it was not complete. "What you brought to this was not only unpredictability, it was something I had not factored into my models." He paused again. "The willingness to keep coming back, not because the data required it, because it seemed like the right thing to do." I looked at the wave patterns for a moment. "I grew up in a place where things broke all the time," I said. "The life support, the water systems, the power grid, the domes. Every time something broke, people fixed it. Not because they were certain it would work, because giving up meant something worse." I shrugged slightly. "I guess I just applied the same logic to a 41-meter creature from the early Cretaceous equivalent of whatever planet it came from." Keth Saran was quiet for a moment. Then, in a very careful way, he made a Vorkai expression that I had learned in our weeks together, was the equivalent of a smile. "There is a word in Vorkai," he said, "for the quality of continuing when the outcome is uncertain, not because you have calculated the odds, but because the alternative is worse. It is a very old word. It dates from the early Vorkai period, before we had starships or data modeling or galactic catalogs, when we were still figuring out what we were." "What's the word?" He said it. It was 3 syllables in Vorkai, smooth and precise. "What does it translate to?" I asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Approximately," he said, "courage, but older than bravery. More stubborn than heroism." He paused. "The literal translation is closer to the refusal to leave something alone that needs to be heard." I looked at the wave patterns one more time. Jagged and complicated and full of a language we had only just begun to understand. "I like that," I said. I flew back to Vareth 9 3 days later on a Vorkai transport. Venshala was on the same ship, which had not been planned, and she sat across from me in the observation lounge for a long time before she spoke. She was very old. Old enough that the years showed not as weakness but as a kind of settled mass, the same way mountains show their age. She looked at me with eyes that had seen 60 years of the thing I had only just begun to understand. The vast, complicated project of different kinds of minds trying to exist in the same universe. "You were not afraid," she said. "I was afraid," I said. "I just kept going anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "That is rarer than you think." "I know," I said. "But it shouldn't be." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "When the council membership review convenes, I will be speaking on humanity's behalf. I will be speaking about what I saw on that moon. I will be speaking about a 19-year-old with no weapons and a partial translation model, and a gut feeling that something needed to be heard." She paused. "I think the council will find it persuasive." I looked out the observation window at the stars. They looked the same as they always had. Still and far and perfectly indifferent. The way the universe is when it is not paying attention to the things happening inside it. But something had happened. Something small and strange and very loud. And it had changed things in ways that were still spreading outward from that silent arena on a nameless moon. Spreading outward through the decisions and the votes, and the classifications, and the new words in old languages that would be used for years to try to describe what had occurred. I thought about the last thing the Vrethkai had said, translated imperfectly through a model that was still learning. Passed through the voice of a scientist who had spent his whole career looking for exactly this. I was alone, now something heard. I thought about what it had felt like to stand in that arena, bruised and tired and afraid, and to keep coming back anyway. Not because I had a plan, not because I had calculated the odds, but because something was trying very hard to say something, and the universe is very large and very old and full of things that have been trying to say something for a very long time. And someone ought to be paying attention. I had been the only human in that chamber when the question was asked. The only human in an assembly of 47 civilizations, sitting in the back row in a uniform 2 sizes too large, with no vote and no voice and no seat at the front. I had put my hand up. I had not done it because I was brave or calculated or strategic. I had done it because on Mars Colony 4, When something needed doing and no one was moving, you moved. You did not wait for the person with the better credentials, or the bigger ship, or the longer history. You moved because you were there and the thing needed doing. The stars outside the observation window were still indifferent. The universe was still vast and old, and largely unaware of the small things happening inside it. But the small things were happening anyway. I settled back in my seat, and I closed my eyes. And somewhere behind me in the trade lanes of the galactic community, a nameless moon circled its planet in protected silence, and in a secure facility being built at its edge. The slow and complicated work of learning to truly understand a creature that had been alone for 400 million years was just beginning. It would take time, it would be difficult. There would be setbacks and frustrations, and many moments when the gap between one kind of mind and another felt uncrossable. But someone would keep coming back. That was what we did. I was beginning to understand what we had always done.